This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming in, whichever of the three of us you were hoping to hear, because I don't believe anyone here is equally interested in what all three of us are going to be talking about. If you are, you are certainly a polymath. So I'm going to talk about, as I just said, I'm going to talk about pedagogy, Paideia. I'll explain that term in case you don't know it, and the role of spiritual exercises in US Jesuit education particularly. So, one word of warning about the language I'm using here. Having spent the first 35 years of my life in this country and this next 33 in the States, I am totally bilingual. But when I do tend to use the word school in the American sense, which is probably more or less what you would mean by going to university. So if I say school, you might think university. So, in the larger paper of which this is a digest, or perhaps the larger paper to be written of which this is an anticipation, and I'm not telling you which, I would go to considerable lengths for this kind of audience to explain how the role of Jesuit education in the United States differs substantially from the British and probably most other contexts. But here I have to summarize. So let me say that although there are 55 Jesuit high schools, the colleges and universities that serve the undergraduate and graduate populations are my particular focus here. There are 28 of these institutions, from tiny Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, to the giants, Georgetown, Boston College, and Fordham, and everything in between. My own institution, Fairfield University in Connecticut, about an hour outside New York City, can serve as an example of those between these two extremes. A little short of 4,000 full-time traditional age undergraduates, most of them from middle and upper class Catholic backgrounds, and about a quarter as many graduate students. A faculty that is as religiously, ethnically, and culturally pluralistic as you will find anywhere. A handful of Jesuits teaching and holding various administrative positions. The peculiar situation of Jesuit education in the United States, where the 28 Jesuit universities compete for students in the open market of 1,600 private non-profit institutions, over 200 of them explicitly Catholic in ethos, means that presenting a strong profile, or in the language of marketing professionals, a clear brand, leads to close attention to the particular shape of a curriculum and an institutional ethos that can be explained as distinctly Jesuit or Ignatian. I like to believe that the strongly Jesuit or Ignatian emphasis on mission and identity is driven by a commitment to the values of this kind of education, of which more shortly. But it would be naive to think that the need for niche marketing did not play at least a supporting role. A second phenomenon that may not be immediately apparent to those who do not know the United States is that all the Jesuit institutions, with perhaps one exception, offer a large core curriculum in the liberal arts that can take as much as 50% of the students' four-year undergraduate program, whatever their major or their concentration will be. It might be nursing, it might be engineering, but it's still anything up to 50% is spent in the liberal arts study. Now, whether authentic or not, this is consistently presented as a modern-day equivalent pedagogical focus of the colleges from the first 2 centuries of the Society of Jesus, though those colleges were, of course, more like what we would consider to be high schools or secondary education. Consequently, shaping a curriculum and articulating its mission for the whole student body is more feasible than it would be where undergraduate education is more specialized. So against this background, and in the few minutes I have available, I want to touch on 4 topics very briefly. First, a preference for the more all-embracing notion of Paideia, rather than the narrower but important notion of pedagogy. Second, The role of the spiritual exercises, and in particular the meditation on the two standards, as a formative influence on Jesuit Paideia. Third, the growing importance of eloquentia perfecta in US Jesuit undergraduate education and its relationship to the spiritual exercises. And finally, the relationship between the rhetoric of Jesuit Paideia and the character of a religiously pluralistic faculty. So, first, in the US context, where students are relatively captive on a campus 24/7, the term pedagogy does not adequately convey the educational mission of the Jesuit institution. Pedagogy sounds like a fancy term for classroom technique, and so sometimes it is. But when we strip Ignatian pedagogy down to its bare essentials, the holy triad of experience, reflection, and action, it is immediately apparent that what we normally think of as classroom exercises not only do not exhaust the learning process, but in fact are simply one component in a much more complex phenomenon. In a precisely similar way to that of classroom pedagogy, the total educational impact of the entire institution, which is what I mean by the term Paideia, is to be measured by something other than the acquisition of knowledge, life skills, or the fast track to a lucrative career. One of the phrases that we use, perhaps too often, to signal this larger purpose is that of forming men and women for others. But even if it might be overused at times, it testifies to what can only be described as a countercultural commitment. A similar and sharper tagline is used by the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, in which many graduates and others spend a year of service before embarking on a career or going on to graduate school. Enter the JVC, they proudly say, and you will be ruined for life. So Jesuit schools are not exactly in the business of social replication, but rather of education for social transformation. I was heartened to hear Father Nicolas say that this morning. Whenever schools explain their purpose in categories like wisdom or compassion, they testify to this kind of self-understanding, and it is certainly not the province of Jesuit or Catholic schools alone. However, the uniqueness of Catholic and Jesuit traditions may lie in their capacity to marry a firm sense that the world desperately needs a social transformation, with an equally firm hope in the capacity for change, itself supported by a religiously based conviction of the goodness of the human person and the human world. One of the few remarks of the American academic Stanley Fish with which I am in agreement is his observation that, and I quote, "Education is not in the business of making good people," unquote. However, it is entirely another matter to bring the student to a place where she or he can quicken the goodness that is always already there. Education is not indoctrination, but it is formation. This does not occur solely because a student is provided with a great deal of factual information or equipped with technical proficiency. It requires an ethos. Teachers play a central but not exhaustive role in education. Education happens, sometimes despite ourselves, in the particular mix of classroom instruction, role modeling, experiential learning, and peer interaction that makes up the entire life of the student during the 4 undergraduate years, 4 in the States. Paideia, rather than pedagogy, should be our focus, because it forces us to pay attention to far more than the narrow confines of the classroom. The values and practices of the entire institution teach in ways that classroom instruction alone does not. They should lead our students to an awareness of the world for which we are preparing them, to take an attitude to that world. It is not our job to tell them what attitude to take, but it is a major part of the responsibility of the entire educational community to create the circumstances in which students will learn how to choose with integrity. Paideia thus links the cognitive and the ethical. So, second point was where the spiritual exercises come into play. It is safe to say that the spiritual exercises are where the distinctively Jesuit way of looking at what it is to be human and what it means to live humanely in the world can be found. Based on Ignatius's own lived experience of prayer and reflection, the exercises are in essence an extended series of meditations. I know I'm not telling most of you anything you don't know, through which the one doing the exercises examines his or her relationship to Christ, comes to terms with the warring impulses within that move the exercitant to a more or less generous response to Christ, and leads to a decision concerning a state in life. But if the primary purpose of the exercises is to bring individuals closer to Christ through a retreat experience, it is no less true that some of the central insights of the exercises lie at the heart of Jesuit convictions about the educational process. It is also the case that their usefulness is not necessarily tied to the explicitly Christian language in which Ignatius thought and which Jesuits today obviously still espouse. While there are important things to be said in this context, both about the first principle and foundation and the final contemplation for achieving love, here I have time only to address the most significant moment in the exercises for the educational mission, the key meditation known as the two standards. In Ignatius's formulation, the exercitant is invited to view a great plain where the armies of Christ and Lucifer are arrayed, and to determine under which banner to stand and fight. This imaginative exercise is directed towards seeing how the world is a place of struggle between the forces of good and evil. Ignatius encourages us to use our imaginations to see into the essence of things, to see that the world is a site of decision-making, that we really cannot just absolve ourselves from the need to take sides. Will we side with the forces of good, with everything that supports human flourishing? Or will we side with the forces of evil, of all that is destined in the end to narrow and destroy the truth of human community and solidarity? Less dramatically, but no less critically, will we be outward-oriented people or locked into egocentrism, however carefully masked? Here we can locate the two critical components of Ignatian education. The first is the careful and imaginative attention to the details of the world. In other words, the educational importance of understanding the world in which we live in the most sophisticated and critically aware manner of which we are capable. This is where we can confidently affirm that everything taught in the most theoretical and the most practical of our classrooms, from pure mathematics to accounting practice, is integral to Jesuit education, because it all contributes to the enrichment of our awareness of how our world really works, upon which is built the second component, the call to make a decision which will be consistent with the foundational understanding of the human person and the human community. And this is where Paideia is most apparent, because the capacity to make a good decision is not simply acquired in the classroom. It comes to pass as a result of the entire educational process. In the classroom, in the values absorbed by living within a community that practices what it preaches, and in the informal exchanges within a community with a common vision. Point 3, eloquentia perfecta. A significant number of the American Jesuit universities are making more frequent use of the term eloquentia perfecta in describing the undergraduate educational mission. While this language is largely for internal consumption and is occasioned in part by sheer ennui with the kumbaya-ish overtones of men and women for others, it represents no shift at all from the holistic vision of education as formation. No less a scholar than John O'Malley has written that perfect eloquence is the most immediate goal of rhetorical training. And the central virtue of rhetoric is prudence or good judgment, through which the tradition, says O'Malley, and I quote, hopes to turn students into adults who make humane decisions for themselves and for any group they might be leading. O'Malley's invocation of prudence returns us to the logic of the exercises. Both the heart of Christian maturity and of civic virtue can be found in the consistent capacity to make good decisions and to stick by them. It is this awareness that makes possible in Jesuit institutions of higher education a commitment to education for the real world that is born out of the exercises but which speaks to anyone of any or no religious conviction who is able to be something other than self-oriented. The appeal to the heart and the informed will that is the focus of the exercises is not something that can grow dated, since its dynamism lies not so much in the text as in the subject engaging in the exercises. Worthy efforts have been made over the years to produce updated versions of the ratio, but no one has suggested updating the exercises. The structures of the curriculum are subject to change. The call to the generosity of the human heart is not. So the challenge for Jesuit education, wherever it takes place, is to contain within it the essential call of the exercises to the recognition of all that we have as gift and the responsibility we have for that gift, to sane and sophisticated analysis of the good and evil in our world, and to the lived choice for true human flourishing in the world that is our home. In John O'Malley's words, again, I quote, "A wise person, somebody, that is, whose judgment you respect, and to whom you would go for personal advice, rather than to the technocrat, the bureaucrat, and the zealot." 4. There remains the complex issue of how to incorporate fully into this vision of education those whose spiritual convictions differ from those which animate Jesuit institutions. I am fairly sure that this vision of the Jesuit University as committed to moral education is distinctly different from the British University, where all higher education outside seminaries seems to me to be deliberately secular. And yet, the US Jesuit vision is not narrowly sectarian and certainly no more pious than its classical antecedents in Plato, Cicero, and Quintilian. Buddhist or atheistic faculty who teach in Jesuit schools, and there are many of each, occasionally find the language of Jesuit mission a little tiresome, but rarely fail to recognize the values of the Paideia. This, it seems to me, once again, is because the educational roots in the exercises speak to the human qua human, not the Christian qua Christian. Another way to say this is that Ignatius sought to school the exercitants in the virtue of discernment, and discernment is not the possession of Catholics alone, or indeed of all Catholics. The moral education or formation of the undergraduate could not be further from indoctrination. It is simply education in the capacity to choose the good, which requires sustained and critical attention to the real world of our times. Shorn of the language of the Christian gospel, in which Ignatius clearly understood his vision, this is the continuing purpose of the exercises. Now, I'm not sure how this set of reflections applies to other contexts than that of the United States. Wherever Jesuits still run high schools, it certainly has a part to play. Wherever education in the humanities is under threat, which is certainly true in the UK and becoming so in the US, this history has an important counter message to present. It is also an important corrective to the common misconception, understandable enough, that somehow or other the Catholic tradition is antithetical to humanism or human freedom. Finally, the notion of the entire institution as a teaching instrument, this idea of Paideia, may have more than a little to offer to those academic institutions, wherever they may be, who are dedicated to the production of what Christopher Mooney, S.J., once memorably called well-trained barbarians. So let me end with two questions. First, a question for the American situation. Is the attention to the Jesuit mission and identity of our universities a mere smokescreen? Not so much in the sense that it is inauthentic, but more that what we offer at our best is little, if any, different from what our competitor private and indeed public educational institutions strive to achieve. In other words, is there a real value-added component to Jesuit higher education in the US? Second question to our present context here. Is Jesuit education in any value-added way either possible or desirable in the British context in general and that of Heythrop in particular? This has a somewhat drab and practical side. Can you have Paideia when everyone goes home at night? And something more substantial. Is it simply that Catholic rather than Jesuit is the appropriate denominator for Heythrop or any similar institution anywhere in the world? And does this simply refer us to a theological and religious tradition, rather than to an ethos of formation for civic engagement in the critical issues of our contemporary world. And before anyone grabs me by the throat, here's my final sentence. I think I may know something of how to answer the first of these questions, that I asked the second in a spirit of honest and even naive inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for that admirably clear and beautifully crafted piece of writing that gets just inside the time. Given the diversity of the papers, I'm proposing to take questions on each one separately. So if there is anyone who would like to respond to Paul's paper or raise a question, please feel free to do so. Alan, should be microphones running around? Courage? Right. Sorry, Courage is a guy. I love the way French people say to me every morning, bon courage.
I've been in 85 schools in England. I'm very concerned that our teaching is really training just to make machines in the office or whatever, with a standard of literacy which is appalling, rather than formation education. And it does seem in the 1988 Education Act, it talks about preparing the spiritual, cultural, physical, etc. For adult life. And I just don't believe we're doing this. And the statistics are quite clear. 1 million kids have gone through comprehensive without any education at all. That's the national audit figure 2006. And 1 in 4 are suffering from depression. I worked with them for 14 years, so it takes 7 to 9 years to get somebody off drugs or drink. And it seems to me that the Hindus, for example, I've been in a temple for 10 years, they go straight into our universities. So that we need it seems to me we need to attract people back to realizing the spiritual value of being in a spiritual community. I just wondered if you could reflect on that for me from the information.
Well, I wouldn't like you to think that I would be suggesting that everything in the garden across the Atlantic is wonderful and everything here is. Many of the things you're mentioning as deficiencies in the secondary education system are parallels in the States. One of the peculiarities of what I'm talking about here is that it is extraordinarily elitist. Both the high schools and the Jesuit universities are expensive. And we have all sorts of ways of trying to broaden the population, but in general, it's people who come in with a relatively good level of education to begin with and then benefit from what we have to offer. And I don't know that, the problem in the States is how to make the virtues of private education more available in public education, which I think is similar to the issue you're talking about. The curiosity, of course, is that Catholic parochial schools in the States, which now are often the only alternative to public institutions in the inner cities, and they are filled by people who are overwhelmingly not Catholic, and they're benefiting from an ethos. So I think, all education began originally with the notion of a college of teachers and ethos, and I don't know how we restore that. I feel myself that what we're doing is we're looking at breakdowns in education against the background of larger cultural breakdowns, and I don't think we can solve those. We can solve the education system without addressing those. I have no particular words of hope to offer you there, except that this the more one can have an ethos which is shared by everyone who works in the institution, and I mean everyone in their own way, from the lowliest member of staff to the principal or headmaster. That's the way you have some hope. But how you address that in a public institution, here or there, I really don't know.
Gentleman here.
Could I take 2 points that you made in your talk?
Maybe just one.
One question.
Please be brief.
The discernment one Jesuit has to be able to achieve after the prayer between the need and
Microphone, please. Could you put the microphone nearer to your mouth?
In Jesuit training, as we see from Pope Francis, one has to be able, in the end, to be able to discern confidently between God and the devil, good and evil, and so on. At the same time, the Jesuit ethos is open to different cultures and studies different cultures and sees the values in them in ways that can be seen as relativistic in some way. Multiculturalism is a problem in this country at the moment because values have been introduced that seem to be anathema to anything that is within, let's say, not the Christian culture, human rights. So how do those two different strands of Jesuit education work out in practice in the institution?
If I understand your concern clearly enough, I would want to put my theologian's hat on at this point and ask for people to discern where the grace of God is at work. And the grace of God is certainly not at work solely in Christian or the Northern Hemisphere or in white people or whatever. The grace of God is present in any and every situation. And in fact, we meet the grace of God in alien, what we would consider perhaps to be alien cultures. The challenge is to discern where it is and where it's present and where it's not. And the challenge is to discern equally, reflexively, where it is present and not in our own culture. So I don't feel as threatened by multiculturalism. And we have our own multiculturalism in the States, and we remain, regrettably, a profoundly racist society. But the way to overcome that is to be aware that the grace of God is offered to us from the most unlikely of sources. And a lot of it has to do with listening, I think.
We can take one more very brief question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the Jesuits for the education and everything. Michael Paul Gallagher, an Irish Jesuit who is now in Rome. He taught in University College Dublin. His pastoral ministry, his ethos, was transmitted not as a chaplain, but in his office. In fact, in his book, Where is Your God?, he talks about the experience of bringing a student from poetry into an experience of these spiritual exercises, not with a word, not with a language, but into an awareness of what eventually is the grace of God. So when somebody was asking how can we bring this spirituality, this grace of God into the public schools, into the education, is it us? Is it maybe the Jesuits now trying to engage from theology into experience of teaching teachers, not like it's done in Madrid, that they're teaching for the Jesuit schools, because you don't have enough Jesuits anymore, but maybe to teach us, professionals, into the Ignatian spirituality, so that we can bring that with our own individual ethos. Maybe it will be in our own, maybe there will be another person in the school, so that this ethos is transmitted into the schools. Thank you very much.
From what I understand, from my own limited experience, Jesuits are hard at work doing that kind of thing. Certainly in the States, and I'm equally confident here.
Thank you very much indeed to Paul for a very serious